Hello there, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to my first video on a Deadzone tournament. Even though I'm not incredibly fluent in the rules yet, I decided that's the best way to learn. Go to a tournament, play against a variety of players, most of them with more experience of the game than I do, and I'll pick up plenty of the rules and various tips and tactics along the way, and also get some experience against different factions. So when you play against a small pool of players, generally you end up facing the same thing over and over again. So it's not good for your development. So this tournament was at Black Dragon Miniatures in Hinckley, and it was 200 points, which makes them the biggest games I've played yet. On top of the standard rules, there were a few little alterations. There were no mercs allowed, and there were no secret missions, which I can understand from a tournament point of view because they can skew things quite wildly, apparently. It was planned for there to be 6 games in this tournament, however they decided to scale it back to 4 in the end. As far as tournament scoring goes, I don't usually look at that too closely, but there doesn't seem to be anything too crazy going on with it. Basically, win a lot of games and you'll be near the top of the leaderboard, lose a lot of games and you'll be near the bottom, that's all I need to know. One other notable thing is that victory points are worked out at the end of a turn. So that means if your first activation in a turn would carry you over the requirement of 20 victory points, then you still have to play out the entire turn, and the enemy then has a chance to also get to 20, potentially, which would make it a draw. Even if you end up on 28 and they end up on 22, it would still be a draw, I believe. There were a couple of custom scenarios as well, not from the main rulebook. I'll give you the details on those when we get to them. So let's have a quick look at my force first of all, shall we? So anyone with a particularly trained Deadzone eye will know that this isn't 200 points. I have the Stage 1A, the big guy, as the leader, 3 Stage 2s, a specialist with an HMG, which is the guy in the centre right, 2 dogs, and 5 regular Stage 3s. No particular special upgrades on anybody, and of course the 2 dogs as well. So these are all the models I own, so to get it up to 200 points I arranged to borrow an aberration as well. I wanted to borrow as few models as possible, keep my model count from becoming obscene, because I knew I probably wasn't going to be able to finish all my games, since I'm not that fluent with the rules yet. And also only adding one unfamiliar model would mean that I would spend less time looking back and forth at the rules for it, since I'm already somewhat familiar with all the models I actually own since I have played with them before. So on to game 1, and this was one of the custom scenarios. This was known as Drop Pod Chaos, and the gist of this was that instead of the regular method of deployment, models were randomly dropped in, up to 3 cubes in. So it's quite a large area that your troops could be spread over, and I thought this might be quite good for me since I'm using the plague, obviously, so I want to get close as fast as possible, so having the potential deployment zone higher up could be a really good thing for me. Once the game begins, it's pretty much the search and destroy mission, and you can see the objectives there, the 2 victory point marker and the 2 1 victory point markers. Before we go any further, I should point out I don't feel that's enough, really. I do have a slight problem with all the missions in Deadzone, actually. I haven't had that much experience playing them, so maybe my opinion will change with time, but it feels like the actual objectives aren't given enough weight, and that it's very, very easy to just kill things to rack up victory points rather than going for the objectives. I also feel that heavily favours sides that have a lot of shooty abilities, rather than close combat, because the close combat guys will have to come forwards either to kill or to get the objectives, and the shooty armies can pretty much just sit back and pick things off as they emerge into the open to pick up the objectives. If you look at this setup here, only that 1 marker could I potentially sit on unmolested. If I go for the 2 or the 1 on the right, then I'm going to be shot to bits. So that means I can safely pick up 1 victory point per turn and then just hide, which isn't really a lot. That means I only have to have 1 model shot down that turn to even up the game again. So I do think the objectives should be given more weight to encourage a bit more movement from the shooting heavy armies. Just my uneducated opinion at this stage though. Anyway, you can see that with the random drops I ended up with quite a few cramped in there on the left hand side, quite high up, quite near the front, and there isn't much line of sight through those buildings in front of them, so they're relatively safe there. As we pull back a bit, you can see that I've got most of my big guys on the right or in the centre, and they've got a little bit less cover over there. So I'm assuming they're going to get shot at quite heavily at the start. Now, in the first game I was up against the Forge Fathers, as you can see here, and I was saying one of the good things about going to a tournament is that you get to play against a variety of different people and armies, but what do you know, in round 1 I was up against Sam, my regular Kings of War and Deadzone opponent. So I think that was good in a way, because it got us both kind of eased into the Deadzone zone, as it were, before we had to play against anybody else. But I didn't really fancy my chances, because I think I've lost every Deadzone game that we've played so far. You can see that he's got the big drill gun thingy on the left there. And because of the random drops, you can see that a couple of guys ended up right in the open, on top of buildings. One of his certainly did, and one of my stage 2s did as well. Bit of a cinematic view for you here, so you can have a look at the potential lines of sight. You can see on the left there is that one window that he could potentially be looking through if he gets to high ground to look down on most of my weaker forces there on the left. Most of my weaker models will go down in one hit against the Forge Fathers. I'm pretty confident. The more survivable stuff, mostly at the centre and the right. They did have nice terrain setups on all the tables. I was expecting maybe them to be a bit bare, since there were 6 games going on at once, but I was quite satisfied with the amount of terrain. I think Deadzone does need a lot of terrain, especially for the Plague. I don't like firing lanes one bit. And you can see from the side here a view of some of his troops as well. He's got some Brockers and an Engineer, some Steel Warriors. I'm not overly familiar with the names of all the units in the other factions yet. You can see that my HMG wielding specialist has made his way all the way up to the tall tower, and then fired down at the, I believe it was a Steel Warrior completely in the open. Didn't do any damage though, despite having a lot of dice for him being in the open, fully exposed, and the extra height advantage. But of course, with the suppression on that gun, that means that he was able to pin that model. Now, he should have technically pinned every model in that cube, but I forgot about that rule at the time. So the guy next to him should have been pinned as well. And you can see that he's taking a bit of high ground here, which I don't like one bit. Not only does high ground give you an advantage just in terms of an extra dice, but it also makes it much easier to get clear shots on people as well. And it makes it virtually impossible for anyone to get a clear shot on you unless they're on the same level or higher, especially in this case with that tiny little fence in front of him. And there's my dead pile. I believe that was after 1 turn. So all the models I was expecting to be killed in one hit pretty much were. Forge Father shooting, very, very tasty, especially when you can get to higher ground. And you can see where the high quality cover is here, because I've formed a bit of a conga line in that cube there. Most of his shooting is directly on the other side of that, so I don't want to pop out into view and expose myself. But having lost quite a few models already, I'm going to be way down on victory points, so just claiming that one isn't going to be enough, so I'm going to have to push in. Even if it's a suicide run, I'm going to have to just throw myself against that wall of fire and hope that I actually get there. And I've essentially thrown this guy's life away by just launching him into that cube with the final activation of the round, just to get me 2 victory points. Because even if he gets shot off, he's only going to be worth 1. Which may be not a wise move, because, of course, if he survives, he could potentially kill something. But I think chances are, as soon as he was visible, he was going to be killed regardless, so you might as well get some points. And the dog leapt up onto there to get that victory point as well. So my thinking is, he possibly won't be able to kill both of those models that are pretty much in the open. Unless, of course, he gets a few activation dice on his command dice roll. Because I had more models, so likely he was going to be going first most of the time. And you can see I've arranged them in such a way down there, so that the one with the big hand is poking it away from the window and not up to the window. That's very important, because if someone can see your fingernail, they can shoot you. Which I'm not sure is ideal for a tournament game, because it does encourage modelling for advantage. In some ways it balances out, because if the model is really wide, it's easy to see, but it's also difficult to get a clear shot on it. So it balances out in some ways. But I think true line of sight in general is another thing that's a little bit fiddly for tournaments, because you are going to get into arguments eventually with people over line of sight, I think. Since it's impossible to see perfectly from the model, and it's not even the eye view. I believe it's supposed to be any point on the model can see any point on the enemy model, then you can shoot. So that includes the base from both of them. So you don't really have to poke the model's head round a corner to shoot someone, you just have to poke the edge of their base round a corner, if I'm reading it all right. You can see I've pushed the aberration up there and it's taken some damage. As expected, as soon as anything gets into the open, it's taking heavy firepower. And also when it's damaged, the rampage rule could potentially come into effect, which means it might start going for my troops. So then when you've got a wounded model with rampage, do you activate it first and potentially waste the activation because it goes nuts and attacks your own troops? Or do you take some time moving models away from it to minimise the potential damage if it does go on a rampage, risking the fact that they could actually finish it off completely before you get to go with it? So it's a tricky situation. You can see that I'm pushing up quite a bit now. Because I'm down on victory points from having lost a few models, I decided I just need to get in his face, get into cubes that his models are occupying, and then just start ripping people apart. My HMG on the roof is surviving pretty well actually. I think he's higher than everybody else, which makes it virtually impossible for them to get a clear shot on him, but I think he's still quite vulnerable because their guns are very good. And there's my corpse pile at this stage. It's building up quite nicely, as expected, walking into that wall of fire. Really, with the random deployment, it did limit how I could hide my units. I couldn't pick an optimal position for everybody to keep them out of the firing line, so then immediately losing quite a few models right at the start of the game meant that I was kind of up against it, so I really had to push in and try and kill something. And you can see that I do get right into his face here with the stage 2s. One of them right up on the roof there with those two. But I don't think I successfully kill anyone. I may have dished out a wound or two. But they don't have any AP, these stage 2s, and all the Forge Fathers have armour apart from the Brockers, I believe. And my stage 1, because he's Mr. Slow, he's currently just holding that one victory point. So because I've been pushing forward, I have actually been picking up quite a few victory points without killing things. But my model count is dwindling, but the victory point totals aren't that far apart at this stage. He just has a lot more models left than I do. And I don't believe there was any more notable action after that point. My stage 2s that went in didn't really manage to kill anybody. One of them went through the door that you can see at the top of the screen there, and I don't think he killed anything. So while I did get into combat, didn't manage to inflict any damage, the aberration got horribly gunned down, and I believe my leader rushed out after this in a last-ditch attempt, because I was going to lose regardless, and the way this tournament was structured, you're not punished if your opponent gets a lot of points, it's about what you get. So unless you finish right next to your opponent in the overall table, it's not hurting you that much if they get more points. So you might as well go for it and try and rack up some points on your own. So that's what I was doing there, but it did ultimately get him gunned down. But I think it was worth a try, because he is very survivable. So in the end, my opponent had 21 victory points and killed my leader, which gains a bonus tournament point. And I ended with 13, so I wasn't that far behind, because I was able to rack up a few, like I mentioned, just from pushing up onto the objectives, and I did kill a couple of Brockers, I think, once I did get into range. So the game went pretty much as I expected, looking at the way the game was set up. With most of the objectives being kind of in the open, I knew that I was just going to be walking into a killing field, but the way the random deployment dropped my troops, I didn't really have any choice. I had to just push forward and hope that I could make some decent survive rolls and get into combat. But not enough of them did make it in, and not really early enough, unfortunately. So tactics-wise from that one, I'm not sure what I would have done differently. I suppose I possibly could have tried to wrangle it a bit so that everyone was just hiding as much as possible. And that possibly would have resulted in an even more narrow loss. But then that would have been bad for my tournament score because I would have racked up less victory points. And victory points were used in the case of a tie in the table, I believe. And there was just a set score for winning, or drawing, or losing. And then the amount of victory points you had added on a certain number of tournament points, I think. So losing but scoring a lot of points is preferable to having a really, really narrow loss with no points at all. So that's why I went for it pretty much. I don't usually think about the scoring system that much, but the one thing that did stick in my mind was it doesn't really matter if the opponent racks up a lot of points, it's all about what you do yourself, which can lead to a bit more gung-ho play, unless you're against someone you know for a fact you're going to be competing with at the end for a position in the table, in which case you may want to deprive them of some points. So after losing game 1, I was expecting maybe I'd get a slightly easier time in game 2, since I was guaranteed to get someone that had lost in the first round. So maybe they lost because they had a terrible list, or maybe they just got really unlucky. I was hoping for the former. Now this was the breakthrough scenario, which means that you have to escape from the opponent's table edge, which I thought would suit me quite heavily because I've got a fair bit of speed. My stage 3s and the dogs are quite fast. It doesn't really suit my leader because he's incredibly slow, but I would want to push all my units forward anyway. So if I just do what I would normally do and just charge forward and attack, I'll then be in position to make the most of the scenario objective, which is to escape off the edge. This time I was against the Enforcers, and again a lower model count than I've got. You can see he's got the big Strider there on the right, which I was a little bit concerned about. I'd never faced anything like that before, so I assumed it would just tear a hole through anything it could see, and it had a really sweet firing lane right there as well. This particular table had 2 or 3 really long firing lanes, which wasn't ideal for me heading that way across the table. You can see he's got a sniper in the top right as well, which I was very concerned about, having a little bit of experience using a sniper in my first few games when I was playing with the Enforcers. He's got 1 combat Enforcer and several regular guys, and of course the big guy with the cape, whose name escapes me right now, but you know the one. Now, first thing I do is make a push down the left-hand side with the dogs. You can see in this situation one of the dogs is vastly more survivable than the other, because that one on the left is with its paw up in the air like it's begging for a treat or something. It's really just begging to have its head blown off because its ears and its hand poke above most terrain at that level, whereas the other one is really low. So it's really easy to hide it. And I believe that's my HMG pushing up there as well, who has picked up a grenade. And my HMG actually shot somebody in his cube that had 3 models in, and at this point the rule was played correctly. All the models in the cube were pinned, regardless of whether it scores any hits or not. So that HMG is really tasty, which is something the coach did point out when I was asking for advice. So I think adding a second one of them might be a good idea. 3 models pinned, can't argue with that. So that's going to limit him somewhat when he wants to activate those models. You can see a big overview here of my advance. I have got a bit of cover, but you can see the big firing lanes I was talking about, which I'm going to have to break into at some point if I want to rush towards him and his table edge. And he's mainly holding back because he is going to be able to outshoot me, so again, my opponent doesn't need to worry too much about the scenario at all, because I'm going to be coming towards him, which suits him because he wants to shoot me, and I'm going to have to come into the open to get near him. This particular scenario does reward actually escaping the table quite well, because you get the victory points that the opponent would get if they'd killed that model. So there are a lot of victory points up for grabs if you can escape. But again, I still think it's probably easier to just kill everything than it is to escape the table. Because of course, once it escapes the table, then it can take no further part in the game, and you're depriving yourself of any killing it could do once it's gone. You can see that I popped a couple of guys up onto the roof there on the left, because they're going to have some open shots, because his guys that are high up, they don't have any little fences or barrels or anything up there with them, so I'm going to be able to see the entire model and just shoot at them willy-nilly. And you can see that one of his guys is down at the top there. That's probably the work of the HMG again. And I've moved my stage 1 leader right up onto the top there, into the firing line of the sniper, but I thought, well, I want to go in that direction, and maybe if I can tempt him to shoot at me with the sniper, he's less likely to do damage to the stage 1 than he is to anything else. And the stage 1 doesn't have rampage or anything, so if he does a little bit of damage to it, I'm not that concerned. I'd prefer him to shoot at that than the guys that he's just going to kill much more easily, like the stage 2s for example, which will probably go down to a single sniper hit. Although I am sneaking one of my stage 2s under there, as you can see, onto that little passageway. And I did have to check the line of sight to make sure the sniper wouldn't be able to see him, because I didn't want that one bit. I wanted to sneak him up a little bit. He is going to be shot before he gets to the sniper, but he will be in cover for a little while at least. The one at the back that's going for a hug, it's going to be difficult to sneak him up because his arms are so wide, so a little bit of him is likely to be poking into view. And you can see I actually moved the stage 1 back down again, because I didn't like the way it was shaping up ahead. So I didn't want him to be gunned down. I think maybe he moved something really scary into position to look at the stage 1, so I thought, you know what, I'm not having that. Back down the wall I go. Which maybe is a little bit indecisive, but I felt that he was going to be killed, obviously, if I resorted to that. And I didn't feel he was actually going to make it to the other end of the table in time, because he is so slow. And I think I was probably just not getting any move dice with my command dice, even with the rerolls. That's probably why I sent him down again, because he would just be advancing into the open, pretty much. However, slightly later on in the game here, you can see that I obviously did get some juicy move dice, because I was able to get the aberration right in there. And the first thing he did was jump up onto that platform with the guy with the big heavy burst laser there, and he put a wound on him, which is disappointing. Would have liked to kill him and pushed him off the edge, but he was only wounded though. And then the aberration then used a move dice to go down and attack the Strider, but I could only put 2 damage on that, so that thing is pretty damn tough. I've also got the stage 2 up there, which was wounded by the time it got to the sniper, as I anticipated, but I was able to present the enforcers with a lot of targets, because I was really close to getting in their face with 2 or 3 different models at the start of the turn, and they could only activate 1, because I don't think he got any extra activation sides on his command dice, so I was able to get in there, because he couldn't actually kill what he shot at, which I believe was the stage 2, but he couldn't finish it off, so I was able to get there with the sniper, but didn't kill it, which again was disappointing. So this is the second game in a row where I've actually managed to reach close combat, but not matched face enough. So, combination of a little bit of poor dice rolling, and maybe not getting enough troops into combat. You can see that my stage 3, right in the middle of the table there, on the high ground, who's been taking pot shots at the enforcers that are completely in the open, is wounded at this stage. But she stood up to some serious punishment. She was shot so many times, but I just got really, really lucky with the survive rolls on her. So he just couldn't finish her off. He poured so much firepower into her, wasted so much firepower on just a single weak model like that. But she was a threat though, just because he's got so many guys in the open, not at all in cover, which makes any model threatening. You can see that his leader on the left there is pushing forward as well, which I kind of countered by moving my stage 3 right to the edge on the left there on the roof, and was able to shoot him in the open, but couldn't hurt him, because he's a bit of an armoured beast himself. The Strider was able to step away from the aberration, which is bad, and then he could take a nice unobscured shot at it as well and put some damage on it, and there's a guy up there shooting down as well. But he didn't do a great deal of damage to it, but just doing 1 on any model that has Rampage is sometimes sufficient. You can see also that my stage 2 on the roof in the top right is dead now. I can't remember exactly who killed it, but the sniper did move away from it first, which is why that sniper is wounded, I believe. Now, wouldn't you just know it, the wounded aberration, he's in prime position to finish off that Strider, and then he's right in the heart of enemy territory, which means that those 4 victory points that he's worth, I'd be able to then leap off the table and acquire. However, on his Rampage test, I rolled a 2. So it's a 1 in 4 chance that he's going to go nuts, and it happened. So my opponent was able to control him, and he was then able to send him into my stage 2, which was fighting the sniper, and pretty much ripped his head off. So that was really, really bad news. That 1 dice roll could have swayed the game. Overall in this game I actually got fairly lucky with the dice rolls. I made a lot of successful survive rolls, rolled quite well on those, and his attacks weren't having that much impact on me, for the most part. So fairly lucky, but then that 1 pivotal dice roll went against me. You can see here that my stage 1 got to the other end of the table and really wanted to have a go at that Strider. I don't think he was going to be able to make it before the end of the game, unfortunately. And his leader, after dispatching my troops up there in the bottom left, was then unable to reach the edge because the game ended. So pretty much all I had left at the end of the game was my stage 1. Because the aberration, when it returned to my control, I then ran it off the table, because it wasn't close enough to actually attack anybody. So I did get some victory points for that, but I barely killed anything, unfortunately, despite spending a reasonable chunk of the game locked in combat. I just couldn't kill things. So a little bit of bad luck there. So that end result was that I had 7 victory points and my opponent had 14. So another loss, not as many victory points as I would have liked, not enough killing, that was the main problem there. Again, I feel it was an army that I wasn't really set up to deal with very well, because they had a lot of armour and some good weaponry, and not much of my stuff can punch through armour, only a couple of models can, and over half of my army goes down very, very easily to shooting. And of course, with the nature of the scenario, I was forced to walk into his firing line, pretty much. So I think a little bit unlucky though that I didn't kill things when I got there, but I don't have too many complaints about that one. On to game 3. Now, this was another custom scenario, I believe. This was capture the flag. You can see the flag right in the middle of the table there. And the way that works is that you pick up the flag, which then means you can only move 1 cube when you're carrying it. And if you get it back to your scoring cube, which for me is the one with the little like power generator thingy there in my deployment area, if I reach that with the flag, I would get 4 victory points, and my opponent has a similar cube in his deployment zone as well. Now again, I'm not sure 4 is really enough to justify the huge risk of going after that thing, because it takes so long to walk it back. I think the amount of models you would, on average, probably lose carrying it is probably going to add up to more than 4. So that's another case of, I think this scenario needs more points up for grabs for following the objectives. Now you can't see my stage 1 here. That's because a little bit of the game had passed. I believe it was only a couple of activations when I took this picture. So the stage 1, you can just see his hand sticking out on the left side of your screen. You can see the top of his shoulder as well, under that walkway on the left, on that triple building there. And you can see I've got stage 2 all the way on the right with his arm poking out from under a bridge as well. So this table, it didn't provide a huge amount of full blocking cover, but there is a lot of cover in general. There's a lot of low walls, and then on each side there is a lot of blocking cover. So with the stage 2s, I was able to like nip them 2 spaces, and then with a movement dice as well, get them into cover again. So like hop them in and out of cover as they went. So it was quite favourable, that little bit of terrain there. There is a tall tower, which you can see here on the left, which one of his troops moves up next to, right at the start, pretty much, and he's got some kind of rocket launcher, I think, in the top right there. He's got a very low model count with this Forge Father army. I think he only had 6 or 7 models at the most. He didn't have any Brockers, so no cheap units at all. A few Steel Warriors, a few, I think they're maybe Forge Guard, and he's got his leader there in the top left. So, probably what would have been a good idea for him would have just been to sit back, because if I want to go for that flag, I have to get right out in the open, pretty much, and he could just gun me down. But he actually chooses to advance a little bit, including up onto that building there on the left, which you will see turns out to not necessarily be the best move, because with the aid of a movement dice, I'm able to get my stage 1 up there and eat his face. So, losing 1 model when you've got such a low model count army is a big deal. So the stage 1, I believe, claims its first victim. More to come, hopefully. And you can see that I've got the aberration pushing up there, keeping not exactly out of sight, but out of clear sight to pretty much everything he's got. And I've moved a couple of guys up onto high ground so I can then shoot down at some of his ground-based troops, which is something I've started to think about more consciously. And you can see what I was talking about with the potential cover that I could nip in between on the right-hand side. I've got 2 stage 2s there who are slowly funneling their way up towards his troops, and they're virtually out of any potential firing range of anybody, especially since I killed that guy on the roof on the left there with stage 1. And because of that cover that I could just nip in and out of, I was able to get a dog and a stage 2 onto the roof with his rocket launcher, which is really bad news for him. I've got right in his face again. 3rd game in a row where I've actually made it into combat, but this time I did it significantly earlier, I think, and without taking any damage yet. So I'm quite confident now. I've got right into the meat of his forces. Although his leader does make it and pick up the flag, and he's quite a tough character to take down as well, and I don't have a huge amount of shooting that's of any worth, so we'll see whether I can bring him down. And you can see in the top left there that I do in fact catch up with him. He's trying to run away, he goes away at a bit of an angle, but I do get my stage 1 on him. I don't kill him in one go, I do put a bit of damage on him, but he has an ability where he can heal that back. But I have slowed his escape. And you can see the aberration is within striking distance now, having taken only 1 wound. But that rampage test could come back and bite me again. And on the right hand side you can see all my stage 2s are right in there. I think the one furthest on the right actually popped out and killed somebody. It was previously hiding inside the little building there, right below it, and just emerged, ripped someone to pieces. The 2 on the roof having a lot of trouble taking down that rocket launcher actually, and I think he killed the dog. But at least I've kind of got him penned in that corner, and my big gribbly stuff is right in there, so it's not looking good for him at all at this stage. I've got my HMG quite high up, laying down withering, suppressing fire on his troops that were peeking out of the doorway. I'm really liking this HMG and that suppression effect. And you can see there that my aberration has got right into him now, obviously passed its rampage test, and has got into one of his steel warriors at the back. And my stage 2 in the middle is heading over to possibly support the stage 1 in case anything goes horribly wrong over there, but it's pretty much a mopping up operation now. He hasn't got much left, and I've just chewed through his lines without too much difficulty, actually. And there is the final shot of the game. I actually managed to kill everything, so tabling my opponent. Couldn't get the flag back to my victory cube, so that means I'm not going to be able to get maximum victory points. But killing his leader is going to give me a nice bonus point, and I barely lost anything. I only lost a few really cheap models, I think. The dogs, and a few of the other stage 3s, I think. So he got 6 victory points, and I got 18, and killed the leader, so there's going to be a bonus for that as well. So that was my first ever Deadzone win, and I was very pleased with that, especially against the Forge Fathers, who have been the bane of my existence so far in Deadzone. So it was nice to get a win over them. I think the fact that he took such an elite list and didn't hang back meant that I was really able to get the meat of my army, the big gribblies, right in there fighting early on. And he kind of did hang back on the right, but with the way the terrain was, I was able to avoid the fire and really get in there with everything that I wanted to. So very successful game there for me. And I was also figuring out the benefits of sending a unit into combat and then sending another one into the same combat and getting that extra dice for having a friend in the cube, and knowing when it's unwise to do that as well. And the order in which you send the models in is obviously important as well. If you send something really weak in there first, then it's probably just going to get killed, so it's not going to be able to offer any support at all. So moving into game 4, I knew I would again be against someone who is fairly low in the table, but I'm working my way up, so I'm hoping I'll have a nice favourable matchup. And I'd wanted to get onto this table for the entire tournament because it looks, not only does it look really cool, these like trenches, it's also ideal for an army like mine that wants to push up, because most of the tables have a lot of terrain on, but it's terrain that has holes in, and all they have to do is just see the top of your head or a tiny bit of your toenail and they can shoot you. But with this terrain, there are a lot of spots where you can hide where there are no holes at all to see through, without getting onto really high ground and looking down. So I think this is the ideal one for me, really. So you can see I set up quite a bit of my stuff in the bottom left there because that's the lowest point I could set up on. And the rest of it, I think I won the recon test and had the option of moving some models an extra cube. So my stage 1 and the aberration were immediately dropped down into the trench at the start of the game to stop them being immediately targeted. This scenario, by the way, was Search and Destroy, which is pretty much the same as Game 1 apart from the lack of drop pod deployment. And I was against the Veermin, which I'd never played before. You can see he's got a couple of unpainted models there. I think there's 4 of them, but the majority of the army was painted. He's got some big gribbly thing there at the bottom of the screen, which has moved up already when this picture was taken. He's got a guy with drills there in the top left, and a big giant gun towards the middle there. I think the guy next to that is his leader. I was completely unfamiliar with what any of these units did, so I was just having to learn on the fly. The victory points were marked by the heart there, which was the 2 points, and the 1 point were just out of the shot here, just below, in the trench. You can see I've dropped down one of my stage 3s onto that victory point, so I'm going to be picking that up. He didn't have much shooty stuff on this side of the table, so I was able to advance quite a bit without worrying too much about being gunned down. And on the right hand side I used a doggy to get that victory point as well. This was right at the end of the turn, I think I moved them in there. And I got my fabled HMG up onto high ground here, and I think you can see someone's buttocks in a pair of jeans there in the background. Inadvertent, of course. You can see that my stage 2s are kind of hiding a bit in there, but they're really just waiting to pounce, because he's going to have to advance down this trench here to get me off that victory point, presumably, with some of his stuff around this side. And it's not the most potent in shooting, so he's going to have to get in there, which means he's going to be in range for me to jump down on him and eat some face, hopefully. And over on the right, I'm pushing everything up slowly behind the aberration, keeping one dog in reserve. I kind of learned not to suicide the dogs, because they are useful for just leaping onto those little victory points at the end of the turn. So I didn't want them to rush in and get killed, so holding one back there. This is the view from his side of the table, and you can see that he's pushing up a bit as well. He's mostly a close combat army also, so it kind of suits both of us that we have to advance towards each other. He's got a couple of guys hiding in that building there in the centre. A lot of these buildings didn't have windows as well, so a lot of full blockage of line of sight on this table. Now, my stage 1. Here's big crawly rat monster. I don't believe it is actually called that, by the way. My stage 1 couldn't resist going in there and just chewing it to bits in one go, which it did. However, I then knew that I was going to be completely in the open, to be shot by that big gun there, and by everything else. I wasn't overly concerned because it's very, very survivable, but of course he is my leader as well, so it wouldn't be ideal if he got killed. But I couldn't resist. You just got to throw him in there, it's just fun. And his big rat with the drills did actually kill my little insignificant stage 3 on that victory point there. But then, one of my stage 2s leapt down there and chomped it to bits in one go. So I must have got a good roll there to kill that in one fell swoop. I don't think I took a picture, by the way, but my HMG did suppress a cube with 4 models in it at one point during this game. I just neglected to take a picture of that for some reason, but that was a highlight. And I think it actually killed someone with that shot as well. I don't know why I didn't take a picture of that. And you can see that the weight of fire from virtually his entire army brings down my stage 1, which I wasn't too bothered about because he did have to sacrifice shooting his entire army at it for just over a turn, I believe. So everything else was able to move up unmolested. And then look at this. When I was able to get both my dogs in, this is his leader that he retreated because he didn't want the aberration to get it, presumably. But my dogs, who are a little bit nippier, with the aid of a command dice as well, I was able to get extra movement for one of them. Got them both into combat with him, and they killed him. How embarrassing to be killed by 6-point dogs. So I had to take a picture of that moment. And at this point, I am just chewing through his army completely. I get stage 2 up there into his hiding units. Only wound that guy though, don't kill him. And then my HMG and the guy on the roof there who had been laying down some fire on his troops directly in front of them. You can see just over the top of the roof there that one of my stage 2s, the guy going for a hug, had leapt in there and just started ripping people to shreds. And there you can see him sitting on the victory point there. And because I was sitting on all the victory points and killed a ton of things this turn, I was able to go above the victory threshold in victory points. So he got 8 and killed my leader, and I got 25 and killed his leader, so it was a very, very big win that. I was able to acquire a lot of points at the end. His stuff having no armour, that's the first time I'd faced an army that just didn't have armour virtually across the board, and I was able to just mince things. So I think I need to gently encourage anyone I know to get a Deadzone faction that doesn't have any armour, just so I can rip your face off. So, very, very successful 2 games, my first 2 Deadzone wins. After the first 2 losses, I wasn't sure if I was going to win any games at all, and I would have been happy leaving the tournament with just 1 draw, probably, with my limited Deadzone experience. I think there was one person at the tournament who had less experience than me, but I didn't actually play against them. Everyone else was either comparable or had vastly more experience than I did. I avoided all the big hitters by virtue of losing my first game, so I didn't face any of the, what you would call the top 2 or 3 really knowledgeable players that have played a lot of games. But getting 2 wins, I'm very, very pleased with that. And that actually moved me up to 6th place out of 12. So a top half finish in my first tournament, having only played 3 or 4 really, really mild practice games where we got most of the rules wrong probably. So very thrilled with that outcome. And you can look at a picture of me here posing with the Space Marine in Black Dragon miniatures. So overall, it was a very, very good experience. I think I'll talk more about the ins and outs of the venue and the atmosphere and everything on the 2D6 Friday show. And I'll talk more about tournaments in general. But this was a very, very good one. I've been to a Kings of War tournament here as well, and it's very well run. Lots of space around the tables, so you're not bumping into people all the time. And hopefully the Deadzone tournament community will flourish, because it is a very fun, quick, easy to pick up game. Going forward, there are a few things I want to add to my Plague force. I'm going to add some zombies, just because they don't give away victory points when they get killed, which I think is a huge deal. And I'm going to convert some Zs into them, so they're going to be my stage Zs, which also have the bonus of them being really short as well, so hopefully hard to shoot. That's not the primary reason though, I just think Zs are hilarious. Also, I do want to add an aberration of my own, or perhaps a plague teraton, something like that, just another big gribbly monster, because that was a lot of fun having something like that, even though it did kind of cost me in Game 2 with its rampage. But as you know from my Kings of War videos and the goblins with their yellow-bellied where they just sometimes refuse to charge. I don't mind having an army that can randomly just decide to not do what you want. I think that actually adds a lot of fun and excitement to the game. Even though it sometimes backfires, I don't mind that really. Fun is the most important thing for me. Even if I'm getting totally destroyed in the game, I can still see the funny side, and I can generally be heard cracking some kind of joke regardless of what's going on in the game. That's just the way I approach these things. So I'm definitely going to attempt to attend more Deadzone tournaments in the future, and I will report on those as well. I'm also looking at doing some battle reports, but it's just a question of how to format them, because it wouldn't work to just sum up at the end of the turn what had happened, because Deadzone is too back and forth with the alternating activations and everything. I think you would miss a lot. But then also, if I were to sum up after every single activation, it would take a ridiculously long time to just play one game. So I'm still weighing up the best way to do battle reports for Deadzone. But when I get that figured out, you'll definitely see some popping up on this channel. There's the option of doing just the entire game recorded live, but I don't think I'm fluent enough in the rules yet for that to be viable, because the entire comments would just be dominated by, you know, in round 2, that guy shouldn't have been able to shoot. Which, while helpful, the 10th time someone mentions it in the comments, it would get a little bit annoying rather than people commenting on the overall tactics or whether they enjoyed the video or not. It does tend to get bogged down with people nitpicking the mistakes if you show the entire game live. Warts and all, as they say. So I'll ponder on it, and keep your eyes peeled, and I'll keep you posted. So anyway, that's all for now, ladies and gentlemen. I will talk to you again soon. Ta-ta!